You're listening to 90 Day Soulmate with the Relationship Engineers, Jim Golnick and Lisett Guevara, only on LA Talk Radio.
Welcome to 90 Day Soulmate with Lisett
and Jim.
Today we've got an incredible program. We hope you are all set for it and we don't shock you too much. Today's program is on trauma, causes, symptoms, cures. In today's society, you can only be affected by some sort of trauma, right? Between COVID-19, things that go on in our life, even just as we get older and we deal with people in our family who maybe pass away.
Yeah.
Downsizings or corporate America. Mm-hmm. Different problems cause different types of trauma. Today we're going to talk about the different types, causes, symptoms, and potential cures of trauma. The difficulties in curing trauma. And we're going to try to weave a little bit of psychology in there, as a little bit of science, a little bit of news, whatever we can do on our way to discussing trauma. Let's start off by saying, what is
trauma?
What is trauma? Trauma is defined as the psychological response to distressing events. Overwhelms your coping ability, which causes disconnection from the ability to cope, from society, from other things. It causes your brain, body to have an internal reaction. It arises from accidents, violence, or loss. There's long-lasting impact on your mental health, and it can manifest as anxiety, depression, flashback. And it can manifest as anxiety, depression, and flashbacks. It can really exhibit and show symptoms in many different ways. We're going to talk about past, present, and future trauma as well.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay, you ready? Let's continue on with this. Let's see what we have up next. Let's look at some of the symptoms of trauma. There are emotional symptoms such as persistent anxiety, fear, or sadness, intense reactions to trauma reminders. So if there's something that reminds you of the trauma, you can have an intense reaction. Physical symptoms where you may have chronic pain, headaches, or fatigue. There may be sleep disturbances or nightmares. And you may not know why you're having them either, right? Mm-hmm. So you can have apparent and known trauma, or you may have hidden trauma. You may have trauma that you don't actually know you have, but you may have symptoms of it.
Okay, that is interesting because some people have some, for example, headache or fatigue, and believe it's the stress or the everyday working, and maybe have some trauma.
It can be an unresolved trauma, mm-hmm. An unresolved issue that is creeping into your life as trauma. Let's look at some of the other symptoms of trauma. Behavioral changes, social withdrawal or avoidance behaviors, risky or self-destructive actions, which may be the opposite of avoidance. You may be engaging too much, maybe in fighting, maybe in social activities. Your cognitive symptoms, difficulty concentrating or remembering. You have intrusive thoughts or flashbacks. When I say you, I'm talking about you general, like us, mm-hmm. Anybody who might be having trauma. Hyperarousal and hypervigilance, constant state of heightened alertness, exaggerated startle response. Mm-hmm. You know, where things that wouldn't normally bother somebody, mm-hmm. You are or maybe extremely annoyed, mm-hmm. or aggravated. So it's aggravated responses. It's heightened response. That's another thing. That's a symptom of trauma. And trauma can be created by stress too.
Yeah.
You know, so ongoing stress and different things there. Let's continue on with this. So simple. There's in psychology, in therapy, there are different ways of categorizing trauma. They all are a little bit different in the category, but the symptoms may show up the same way. And none is better or worse. They're just the way it is categorized. So here, 4 different ways of categorizing trauma. Let's look at number 1, simple trauma. Coming from a one-time isolated event, not associated with shame or stigma. Example of that would be an accident or a natural disaster. Say there was a flood and you were stuck in the middle of it, or an earthquake. That's something that was uncontrollable but hit you, like a tsunami or something. It was once in a lifetime. It happened. You weren't personally responsible for it, but it was a traumatic event. And that's called a simple trauma, one time. Which leads us to complex traumas, right? So complex traumas are prolonged, repeated trauma experiences. They're caused by others, and they're often interpersonal, meaning in relation to someone else in your life. Examples of that can be abuse, harassment, and bullying. And that can be in a relationship, that can be within a family, that can be within a culture, that can be within a society, a school, work. So this trauma can be complicated. It's not, you can't maybe identify it. Maybe it's something that's gone on for a whole bunch of time in your life, and you just thought that's how the world was. You know?
You believe it's normal,
Yeah.
but maybe it's trauma. Yeah.
Yeah. Number 3, there's something called the big T trauma. Trauma with a big T, which is life-threatening, imminent danger situations, which can lead to intense fear or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Examples would be combat, rape, severe accidents, things that are amazingly strongly wired into our brain after it occurs. And it can be physical, mental tie. So, physical abuse, mental abuse that is so strong in nature that it's called trauma with a big T. So if there's trauma with a big T, guess what? There's trauma with a little t, which is non-life-threatening but impactful. Examples would be job loss, witnessing death of someone else, somebody who might be related to you or a friend's parent or loved one. It affects emergency and medical personnel. So this is something for emergency and medical personnel who are witnessing accidents and they're witnessing death on a daily basis. They may be suffering from trauma, what we call little t, because it is impactful, but it's not like the big T trauma.
But it's something is a recurrent.
It's recurring, and that's one of the things. It's non-life-threatening but impactful, and it's typically recurring. But, like job loss isn't necessarily recurring, but you having lost your job, you're out of work today, you're out of work the next day, you recall what your boss said to you when you got fired. Yes, I've been fired before. And I have trauma with a little t.
Did you lose your hair?
Yes, I had little t.
A
little
hair.
testosterone, and my hair went away. No, that's when you have a lot of testosterone, your hair goes away. That's one of the symptoms, right? Yeah. Okay. All right, we'll leave it there.
Sexy ball.
What other symptoms are there? Physical symptoms. Your pulse increases, you sweat, you have nausea, you have digestive issues, shortness of breath, racing thoughts, flashbacks, numbness, fatigue, muscle tension and dizziness, insomnia, nightmares, sensitive startle, panic, attack. And again, the reasons we're bringing up these things is that maybe you have these symptoms and you don't know what they're from, or you know somebody that has these symptoms, and you may start to identify maybe there's something going on or had gone on in their life where now they're different, especially a change. Like if somebody has this change in behavior and you're going, wow, something happened, that these are the symptoms of having trauma. So some of the physical trauma, we just talked about physical. Let's go to the psychological trauma symptoms. Zoning out, like I did there for a second. Had the wrong slide up on screen. Detachment, disassociation, and that can be from loved ones, from life, from society, from people at work. Confusion, shock, lack of motivation, negative self-view, self-blame, and a negative worldview. Denial, disbelief about traumatic event, meaning no, nothing happened. Disassociate with it. You're basically, you're disassociating yourself with the event. Not only that, you're disassociating with others in the world, maybe somebody who's asking you about the event. You just don't want to deal with it. Mm-hmm. So that's another thing. And then you got emotional trauma symptoms, such as feelings of fear and horror, shame, depressed mood and sadness, irritability, moodiness, angry outbursts, disconnected from self and others. Again, some of these overlap because one is a feeling and one is an action, right? You feel disconnected, but then you are disconnected physically. And so these overlap some of these different symptoms. And then lastly, we have behavioral trauma, which is the acting out of these feelings and physicalities and emotions. Hypervigilance, trying to do right and make sure others do right. Always on alert, looking out for somebody hiding in the shadows and something's about to go wrong and I gotta make sure everything's okay. Avoidance of triggers, places, or situations that make you feel uneasy. And these can be triggers to your behaviors that come from the trauma. Social withdrawal, stopping valued activities, that's very important. Substance use, self-harm, comfort eating, basically things that are just to make you feel good, and maybe you're not that you're thinking or not thinking, but just to avoid thinking about it. But go back to this other one. Stopping valued activities. If you know somebody who maybe for 5 years they were involved in karate or in a music group, and then all of a sudden they're just like, I don't want to do that anymore. And they change how they approach life. Mm-hmm. Right? They cut themselves off from activities that they used to like doing.
Yeah.
So that's a major symptom of trauma. And when we come back, those were some of the symptoms, some of the physical, emotional symptoms of trauma. When we come back, we're going to talk about some of the causes, some of the other things that are associated with trauma. Does that sound good?
So yes.
Okay.
We're coming back.
We'll be back after this.
Tired of attracting the wrong type of guy, it was time to give something else a try. She got her computer and started to plan, and created a process to find her man. Soon she went on a perfect date. And then she knew it must be fate. In just 90 days, that is all it took. How she found her match? It is in the book.
90 Days Soulmate is brought to you by 90 Days Solutions.
Welcome back to 90 Days Soulmate with Lisett.
And Jim.
Today we're talking about trauma. We were talking about some of the symptoms before. Now we're going to talk about some of the causes. So let's talk about causes. And when we talk about causes, let's talk about the top 5. So when you hear about, or if you've been a victim of trauma or subject to trauma, these are the typical things that have happened. Childhood abuse or neglect, domestic violence or relational trauma with interpersonal relationships, physical or sexual assault, natural disasters or accidents, war, combat, or terrorism exposure. Those are the top 5 typical and relatable reasons for trauma.
Yeah, and also when you're talking about the child abuse, sometimes we think is minimal for aggressive home, violence, but this is a project. So I have the example of one, a little boy in the school of my son, and he's so aggressive, and the teacher called the parents and said what happened because he attacked everybody in the room. And then one day the father showed up, and the father was aggressive guy.
Oh.
And also
So
attack
learn.
the child in the front of everybody. So that is when you sometimes see, oh, this child is aggressive, but maybe he coming from one home.
So I think there's two things there. There is the child suffers from trauma, but the child's also learning behavior. So maybe how he's acting is from trauma, but the other is maybe it's behavioral, and there's a cross
Because
between the
he's
two, right?
supervised in this environment, and this is the way that he interacts with people.
So that's a very interesting point that you make there. Something that in our talk here, you're talking about childhood, sometimes you just don't know that you had trauma. So what we did is we broke trauma up into three things. We talk about past trauma, where you may have no memory; present, where you're very aware of the trauma because it's happening and you actually feel the symptoms; and then future trauma, you may actually anticipate or create a trauma where none has actually occurred because you're projecting. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's go back through that. Past, something may have happened. You may have no memory of the event. You didn't think it was trauma. It may have happened, even if we talk about epigenetic trauma, it may have happened to someone else, but they've passed on a trait in your DNA that you don't know why it's there. And it can be intergenerational trauma. And that is a real psychological subject. Present, again, very aware of the event. So compare that to past, something that you're not aware of. Present, you're aware of. And again, go back to future. Now, you've probably all heard this, is that if you can imagine something in your mind, think about something in your mind. When you are thinking about it, it is as real of an experience, especially if you have a lot of emotion tied up into it. It's as real as the event actually happening. So something you remember happening, something that is happening, and something that you project is happening impacts you physically and psychologically and subconsciously nearly identically.
Yeah.
Your mind has a hard time distinguishing between past, present, and future, especially when you vividly imagine it, especially when you put a lot of emotion into it, and when you physically are impacted by it. So we can traumatize ourselves by projecting into the future some anticipated failure.
Yeah. Situation.
Some situation. She's going to leave me. I've been traumatized because I fear the worst, and I create trauma, and now I act differently, and guess what? I actually create the event that I was fearing for because of the fear.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's what is that
Sabotage.
self-sabotage.
Yeah.
So trauma can actually be caused by ourselves just projecting something that isn't there. Today's program really isn't focused on that, but we wanted to bring up that you can have trauma from something you don't remember, trauma from something you remember, and trauma from something you project, and that it all can be equated in a way. But we're going to also break the brain down into multiple areas like we did last week and talk a little bit about it. So we want to talk about adulthood trauma, something that we may not actually remember, but we can have traumatic experiences occurring during adulthood, kind of like being in a car accident or losing a job. Now, these things might happen to us, and we might not even think that they're trauma.
It's a trauma, yeah.
Right? We might not think it's traumatic, but then maybe a year later, 2 years later, we're doing something and we act differently because of it. We lost a job and now we fear we're going to lose a job, and now we act differently at work. We're stressed, have anxiety, and then we do stuff at work that cause us to lose a job.
Yeah, how do you know it's a trauma that you have, or what kind of trauma you have?
That could be trauma with a small t.
Yeah.
So, or it could be the point would be is that these things are all and maybe we can call them programs, but trauma is more of something that it is really intense, and it's something people suffer from. Whereas, and we're going to talk about where in the brain this may occur, and then what we can do to potentially offset the dire circumstances, the problems that may be part of it. So childhood trauma typically could be early life abuse, neglect, or other trauma. Example, being bullied at school or witnessing domestic violence can be a trauma, and we may see it again. And as we get older, we may forget about it. But it's in there, right? Everything we've witnessed, everything we see, we've filtered and stored somewhere in that crazy brain of ours.
But sometimes maybe some event can trigger your trauma.
Sure.
Okay.
That basically our brain has tiny little traps, kind of like if you set a trap in the forest for a bear, and it will snap closed when you take that right path.
Okay.
So if you take that path in your brain about something, it's out there in the woods somewhere in your brain, your woods of a brain, that there's that trauma waiting there for the right foot to hit it. And when it does, it snaps closed and you're triggered and you don't know why. But all these traumas have future consequences. And they may be small consequences and they may be large. They may just be a little behavioral difference, or they may be a event that creates the inability to move forward in your life.
Yeah. So now I'm thinking, when I cross the street quickly because I don't want to cross slowly. And I remember when I was a child, I told you the motorcycle also hit me in my foot in the way. So every time they go, I watching around and cross fast. Well, maybe it's a good habit,
To move fast anyway.
Yeah.
So maybe it's trauma, but maybe it was life-saving trauma.
Yeah.
A little warning. What else do we have here? We have in the womb trauma. So you can be traumatized in the womb and not even know it. That trauma experienced during prenatal development can manifest itself years later. Example, maternal stress during pregnancy due to a natural disaster can be put on and put into the child. The child developing feels those stress chemicals, doesn't know why, but they can be programmed with this stress, and they do have feelings and emotions that may not be definable, may not be, but they're down deep in that brain, right? Depending on the development of the child at that point, or the baby. We have epigenetic trauma, which we talked about before. Trauma affects passed through generations. Anxiety or stress inherited from ancestors who survived war, or maybe had violent activities in their home or with their neighbors. So epigenetic, we talked about a few weeks ago, is where your DNA is kind of set and your genes can be turned on and off by chemicals, so you exhibit different behaviors. Your DNA hasn't changed, but you've basically turned something on, a switch has been turned on, and trauma can throw those switches. So once a switch is thrown, say, in an ancestor, it then can be passed with the DNA. It's basically turning a switch on that creates a certain behavior in you, and you don't know why. And now you may be more sensitive to something than you would have been if your ancestor didn't experience that. Epigenetic. Yeah. And what else do we have here? Physical trauma. So let's talk about some of the types of trauma now. This is more present trauma, things that you feel right now. Physical trauma, injury, illness, or physical abuse, breaking a bone in an accident. That is physical trauma. How about chemical? Chemical trauma, exposure to toxins or harmful substances, suffering health issues from chemical exposure at work. Not only do you have to be treated for the chemical, but now you have to be treated for the trauma, right? So it's mental and physical and chemical. Emotional, ongoing emotional abuse or neglect, enduring constant criticism or neglect from a partner. So that's a relation or interrelational trauma. Environmental trauma, natural disasters or unsafe living conditions. Losing a home in a flood or an earthquake can cause this. We have situational trauma, acute stressful events or accidents, being involved in a sudden car crash, something that's a situation typically out of your control. Mm-hmm. You had nothing to do with it. Something happened, and it's a traumatic event. We have relational trauma, which was kind of related back to some of the abuse we talked about before, interpersonal conflict or domestic violence, experiencing abuse in a close relationship. And then we have also mental trauma, psychological stress or mental illness, struggling with anxiety due to workplace pressure. So it may be trauma that is amplified in your own brain because it's in your mind. You're taking a situation and you're making it far worse than it is, or you may be focusing on it and you may be basically amplifying the trauma. So it's an event that you then, I'll say, traumatize. You dramatically increase the trauma. Now, we talked about past and present. How about future trauma? Mm-hmm. How do you create trauma from a future that never happened? One, you fear anticipated traumatic events, or you fear of anticipated. For example, constantly worrying about a potential job loss, as we talked about before. When you fear the potential job loss, you may perform differently, you may act differently, and you may actually create that job loss. How about preparedness trauma? Anxiety over being unprepared, stressing about not being ready for an emergency. So for example, maybe you're going to take a boat ride and you're really worried about what happens if there's something wrong with the boat and I don't have my life preserver, and I start to get really stressed out about being unprepared, and it creates trauma. But it's building up. It's something, it's like almost like neuroticism. It's almost like being built up in your own mind. And again, there's nothing unreal about it because in your mind you think it's real. Projected irrational fear trauma. So distress caused by irrational fears. For example, persistent fear of flying despite safe travel history. I guess one of the examples about that is that I believe flying is something like 431 times safer than driving. It's some amazing number safer. When you talk about the number of people who fly, how many flights are made. But I believe it's the fear of having no control that makes most people think flying is so unsafe. Also, the giant tragedy that happens when there is an incident and how it's in the news. Yeah. Now, people are in car accidents and injured and have fatalities daily, a lot, everywhere, and it almost becomes background noise. But when a plane has a problem, it's in the news, what happened, something had to go wrong. Yeah. It's gigantic because it's never supposed to go wrong, right? 6 sigma. Yeah. It's supposed to be like 1 in 10 million chance of having anything go wrong. Yeah. Let's see what else we have here. Actually, we are going to come back and we're going to talk about the triune brain. We're going to talk about the neocortex, the limbic system, and the stem and cerebellum, human, mammal, and reptilian brain, where trauma may occur in those, and then how to treat those areas, which each have a different form of treatment and a different difficulty in assessing and coming to terms with how to have therapy, how to get the right pharmaceutical, how to cure a challenge with trauma in those areas.
Once upon a time, there was a couple and a newborn baby. Or should I say, a single mum. This brave young lady left her 9-to-5 job to follow her passion and started a consulting business. Her friends helped out. She travelled the world, met new people, and again came home. The woman dated to find a man who would fill her life and fit her plan. She met a guy who checked out ladies. That burned her up. That made her crazy. Other guys were full of verve, into their self, no room for her. And one time she met a man with patch over eye and axe in hand. Then one day she had enough. Her little boy was all grown up. Tired of attracting the wrong type of guy, it was time to give something else a try. She got her computer and started to plan and created a process to find her man. Soon she went on a perfect date. And then she knew it must be fate. In just 90 days, that is all it took. How she found her match? It is in the book.
90 Days Soulmate is brought to you by 90 Days Solutions.
Welcome back to 90 Day Soulmate with Lisett.
And Jim.
Today we're talking about trauma. We talked about symptoms. We talked about causes. Now we're going to talk a little bit about cures. But what we're getting into right now is the triune brain. Last week we brought this up a little bit about the brain, different functions that happen at different levels of the brain and why we can control some better than others. We talked about Freud and the overlap of the id, the ego, and the superego with the triune brain. Now we're going to talk about trauma and the triune brain, because I believe this is a very interesting subject for us to understand and maybe share with you. So the triune brain is that there's the red part of the brain that you see here, which is the outermost neocortex human brain. It's the most human part of the brain. Then the yellow part, which is the limbic system, where emotions are, it's the mammal part of the brain, or they call it the mammalian. And then there's the reptilian, or the stem and cerebellum, which is in the green there. Green, the color of reptiles, right? So the lizard, they call it the lizard part of the brain. And if we continue on with that, let's talk about the reptilian brain, what it does. Survival functions, controls heartbeat, breathing, basic motor skills. A trauma that might occur is a near drowning leading to deep-rooted fear. So when you are traumatizing a survival part of the body, it impacts a lot the reptilian brain, because that's what's responsible for keeping you alive. The constant state of alertness, difficulty relaxing, is something that results from this. And now you have muscle tension, chronic pain, disrupted sleep. So when you are impacted that dramatically and it goes into the reptilian brain, it's something you can't access from conscious thought. So it is a part of you that really is there for your survival, and now it's impacted. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Let's talk about the mammal brain, which is the limbic system, the emotional part of how we interact with other people. It governs emotions, memories, social behaviors. So, for example, trauma could be childhood neglect or domestic violence, which is now emotionally impacting the child. It's disrupted emotional processing, heightened sensitivity, and symptoms can then be anxiety, depression, difficult forming relationships. So what we're doing is we're now talking about how trauma impacts the different parts of the brains on 3 levels, which I think would be kind of interesting, right? Now let's get to the human brain, because this is the thing that we, I think, know most about, and we know most about how to deal with it. With the human brain, it is responsible for the higher functions of the mind, responsible for reasoning, planning, abstract thought. A trauma example could be prolonged stress, like war or discrimination, where you keep thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it, and it's impacting the growing part of your brain. It impacts your brain by having impaired cognitive functions, fragmented sense of self, and the symptoms are difficulty concentrating, intrusive thoughts, and flashbacks. So now, it exists a lot in the prefrontal cortex and the outer neocortex of the brain, is that this trauma is basically marinating. Your brain is marinating in this ongoing trauma, which impacts your ability to concentrate and think.
Okay.
It impacts your behavior every day. So with that all being said, let's talk about some of the therapies that are typically brought in, some of the cures, right? So we are focusing on 4 cures right now. We're going to talk about trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is TFCBT, which is kind of just like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, with trauma-specific interventions. Its focus is to process trauma and develop healthy coping strategies. Techniques include psychoeducation, relaxation, cognitive restructuring, and the goal is to reduce trauma symptoms and improve emotional regulation. So I put that together and said, you know what, let's come up with like a little bit clearer example of what it is. So a session of this trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy would be something like a client discusses a traumatic event while learning relaxation techniques. They then work with the therapist to challenge and reframe negative thoughts linked to the trauma. So it's cognitive-based, it's brain-based, thinking about the trauma and trying to create a new sense of how you think about it, reducing the trauma. The number one thing that we can do as humans is actually approach the problem and try to deal with it. The thing that a lot of people do is they avoid the problem. And by avoiding, there's no way to deal with it. So that was one of the therapies. The second one is something called somatic experiencing, which is a body-centered therapy for healing trauma. Release trauma stored in the body through physical awareness. The techniques utilize body awareness, grounding, and titration techniques. The goal is to restore nervous system balance and reduce trauma's physical impact. And again, I'm like, okay, what's an example of this? What brings it home? The therapist guides the client to focus on physical sensations like tension in the body and helps them gently release the stored trauma through mindful movement or grounding techniques. Part of this is called mindfulness, right? So now you're thinking about how you feel, you're thinking about the trauma, and you're trying to come to terms with it and create a new way of looking at it. Mm-hmm. So very similar in ways to the cognitive, but it's now connected to your body rather than just thinking. It's how to feel. One was how to think. This is more how to feel. They're tied together very nicely. Number 3, something called EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It is a structural therapy using bilateral stimulation, both eyes. It desensitizes and helps reprocess distressing memories through eye movements. The technique includes eye movements, tapping, and auditory stimulation. The goal is to decrease emotional distress and integrate traumatic experiences. Again, let's talk about real life. What is done? What does the therapist do? The client recalls a distressing memory while following the therapist's finger with their eyes. The process is repeated until the memory feels less emotionally charged. When I read this one, I was thinking of neuro-linguistic programming. I was thinking of how the eyes go to the past and go to the future, and they go back and forth. And that by moving the eyes when you're thinking of a memory, kind of can move it from past to present to future as you're doing it. I have no idea if it has anything to do with that. But I know personally, or I feel personally, that by talking through something and integrating the past, the present, and the future in your thought structure, you can now engage more of your brain into dealing with that trauma. Right? It makes you focus on it. It makes you use more of your brain is huge. It's a strong processing. Complex. And if it works, there's something to it. And number 4, narrative therapy. I found this one fascinating. Therapy that focuses on reshaping personal narratives. Its focus is to separate individual identity from the problems. The problems are the problems. It's not the individual person. It helps the person re-author their life stories, explore cultural and societal influences. The goal is to help empower the client and create more positive life meanings. So it's actually creating a new narrative. So it looks at the trauma and creates a new narrative around the trauma. For example, the client tells a story about a personal struggle. The therapist helps them identify strengths within the narrative and reframes the story to empower the client's sense of self. The client becomes in control of the trauma rather than the trauma controlling the client.
Okay.
When we come back, we're going to talk more about cures, therapies, and the triune brain, and come up with the top 10 ways that you can just help yourself deal with trauma as well as help protect yourself from the potential influence of traumatizing events.
Tired of attracting the wrong type of guy, it was time to give something else a try. She got her computer and started to plan and created a process to find her man. Soon she went on a perfect date. And then she knew it must be fate. In just 90 days, that is all it took. How she found her match? It is in the book.
90 Days Soulmate is brought to you by 90 Days Solutions.
Here I am again, at the bubble tea bar. Being single's not so bad. You go to parties when you want. You have the freedom to do what you want. But I want someone to share my life with. I'm afraid to get hurt again. Keep your head down. Don't look. Don't make eye contact. Oh no. Pretend you didn't see her. She's attractive. But probably not my type. She's probably a Scorpio. Too controlling. But she sure is pretty.
Welcome back to 90 Day Soulmate with Lisett.
And Jim.
Today we're talking about trauma. We're talking about cures, symptoms, and causes. And right now we're going to talk about the triune brain real quick and treatments that are used for different portions of the brain. Effective treatment when you have a reptilian brain trauma would be somatic experiencing, biofeedback, and mindfulness practices. How they work, they regulate autonomic responses and release stored trauma. The difficulties, however, are you can have chronic hyperarousal, and persistent muscle tension, which gives you a difficulty in being able to deal with this therapy. Some of the symptoms that you have when you have the reptilian brain trauma is sleep disturbances, resistance to traditional therapy, because it's deep there. It's deep in the brain. Mm. So how about some of the other ones here? Let's look at mammal brain, so the emotional type of stuff. So when we're dealing with the mammal brain treatments, we're looking at effective therapies such as trauma-focused CBT, attachment-based therapies, SSRs to release serotonin in the brain to help mood regulation, lifestyle, change of lifestyle, make sure you have safe relationships and that you do take care of yourself emotionally. Behavioral changes, emotional regulation, expressive arts. So if you see that a lot of this was based around emotion. Mm-hmm. So when you have an emotional injury that creates a trauma or an emotional trauma, those childhood ones of abuse, then you work on the emotional aspects of the limbic system. And that's at least, it's one of the areas you can look for. And again, we're just sharing with you ideas. The best thing to do is go talk to therapists who deal with this on a regular basis. We're just educating. We're not, what is that called? We're not prescribing. Does it make sense?
That's important.
It's very important for everyone to know. Yeah. And I want to jump to this last one, human brain. Some of the successful treatments for human brains, meaning if that's where the trauma is, and we talked about people who were treated badly at work, people who, what was that called? Discrimination. Mm-hmm. That some of the effective therapies are cognitive behavioral therapy, narrative therapy, changing the way you think about the interactions, reframe your thinking patterns, reconstruct life stories, and some of the lifestyle choices that may help with human brain neocortex type traumas would be structured routines and cognitive restructuring, thinking about things differently and getting into routines that are good patterns to be in. let's continue on here with one more human brain trauma way of dealing with it. So here's another one, looking at lifestyle and behavioral support for human brain traumas. Lifestyle reconfiguration, intellectual engagement, mindfulness, meditation, actually using your brain more to work on things. Behavioral challenges, acceptance, commitment to values. So you're actually redefining your core beliefs and values. Therapy integration can combine cognitive behavioral therapy and ACT for resilience, and ongoing challenges could be maintaining a coherent life narrative. And if you saw what we talked about last slide, the other one was having a new routine. So in order to maintain coherency in your life, you may need a coherent routine, because without it, that's very difficult. So say that you and I don't have any trauma, or the trauma we suffered from we're dealing with okay. What's the best way to live life to have the highest resiliency from trauma, or to preclude the impact of life where we know life is going to throw things at us that we're going to react badly to?
Yeah.
So here we go, the top 10. Regular physical activity, engaging in exercise, right? So engaging in exercise like walking, yoga, or strength training helps regulate the nervous system, reducing stress hormones and improving mood. Mindfulness and meditation. Practicing mindfulness or meditation daily can increase awareness of the present moment, reduce anxiety, and improve emotional regulation. Healthy diet. How about that, Lisett?
Yeah, I believe that.
Consuming a balanced diet rich in whole foods, including fruits, vegetables, lean proteins, and healthy fats, supports brain health and overall well-being. Consistent sleep routines, right? 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep. Social support, building and maintaining strong, supportive relationships with family and friend. Those are the top 5 of the top 10. And we're going to finish this show with the bottom 5 of the top 10. Top 10 lifestyle and self-care choices for trauma recovery and resiliency in the face of ongoing traumatic life experiences. Therapeutic practices. Engage in regular therapy sessions, such as trauma-focused CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And it will help process trauma and build coping skills. Stress management. Stress management techniques. So work to incorporate stress-reducing practices like deep breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation, or creative arts that can reduce the impact of stress. Routine and structure. Remember, we were just talking about routine. Establish a consistent daily routine to provide a sense of stability and predictability. Limiting substance use and abuse. Avoid or minimize alcohol and recreational drugs. It will help maintain mental clarity and emotional stability, reducing the risk of re-traumatization. And then finally, journaling can help you in creating your own life narrative by regularly writing about thoughts and feelings. It can help process emotions, gain insight, and track progress in recovery. As well as by journaling, you can create your own narrative. You can create how you want to look at something. Not only how you feel, but how you want to feel.
Yeah, also when we wrote the book, how you write your book is really good way to do this.
So if you want to write about, we have a number of clients who have taken their life stories of trauma or their study of trauma, where they've written their books on how to deal with trauma. So we have a number of psychologists who we've helped write books on their subject matter through right now, how to write your book in 90 days. In any case, thank you for listening to our episode on trauma, causes, symptoms, and cures. Hope you have a great week. And as we said, talk to a therapist if you do have trauma symptoms. This show was just to educate, as we are not prescribing any method or way of dealing with it.
You're listening to 90 Day Soulmate with the Relationship Engineers, Jim Golnick and Lisett Guevara, only on LA Talk Radio.